My boss said, "I'm leaving my wife. We can finally be together like you've always wanted." I was 25. He was 52, and I'd never wanted him for a second. My name is Sierra Miller. Until that Tuesday afternoon, I thought the worst part of my job was fixing PowerPoint slides for executives who earned 5 times my salary. I was a junior project coordinator at Vance Logistics, a mid-sized transportation company in Manhattan. The work was predictable: updating spreadsheets, tracking delayed shipments, preparing quarterly reports, and listening to executives compare supply chain problems to football games. My supervisor was Richard Sterling, the vice president of operations. Richard carried himself like every room belonged to him. He drove a silver Porsche, even though he'd once admitted he couldn't drive a manual. His cologne announced his arrival before he did, and his jet black hair was so heavily dyed it reflected blue under the office lights. He also happened to be married to our CEO, Eleanor Vance. Eleanor had inherited the company from her father 20 years earlier and turned a regional shipping business into a national logistics firm. She owned the company, the building, and, if office gossip was accurate, almost everything Richard loved showing off. He still acted as though he'd built it all himself. For 2 years, I handled the work Richard considered beneath him. I prepared meeting packets before he remembered he had meetings, corrected reports he barely read, organized his travel, replied to ignored clients, and ordered the same Cobb salad every time he worked through lunch. Dressing on the side, no onions, extra bacon. Remembering. Richard's lunch order had always been part of my job. He, however, had somehow convinced himself it meant something more. Late Tuesday afternoon, just after most of the office had emptied, he called me into his office. The accounting department was already dark, leaving the floor unusually quiet. I walked in carrying my tablet. "You wanted the updated Q3 projections." I revised the warehouse estimates and adjusted the fuel costs. Richard wasn't sitting behind his desk. Instead, he leaned casually against the front of it with his jacket unbuttoned, looking far too relaxed for a discussion about quarterly forecasts. "Close the door, Sierra. Is this confidential?" "You could say that." I left the door slightly open anyway. He noticed, but didn't object. "Have a seat." I chose the chair closest to the exit, opened the report, and began reviewing the numbers. The projected margin improves if Newark renews its contract, although legal still hasn't confirmed. "This isn't about Q3. The tone in his voice made me stop. "What is it about?" I held my eyes for a moment before answering. "Us." I lowered the tablet. "There is no us." He chuckled as though I'd made an adorable mistake. "You don't have to keep pretending." "Pretending what?" "That you've been hiding your feelings." Only then did I realize this conversation had nothing to do with work. Richard walked around the desk and stopped between me and the door. "I know this hasn't been easy," he said, watching me go home to Eleanor every night while we kept things professional. I stared at him, waiting for the joke. It never came. "Richard, I honestly have no idea what you're talking about." His smile only grew. "You're always one step ahead of me. You remember my schedule, my reports, even what I like for lunch. Because that's literally my job. You remember what I eat. You remember every meeting." "Richard, I remember those things because correcting your schedule, your reports, and even your lunch orders has literally been my job for the last 2 years. For the first time, his smile faltered. Then he leaned closer. "I'm leaving Eleanor." He delivered the sentence like it was the answer to every problem. "You're leaving your wife." "For you." The word escaped before I could think. "No." Richard simply blinked, as if rejection had never occurred to him. I slipped my phone from my pocket and started the voice recorder. I'd switched it on the moment he said us, not because I'd planned to, but because too many women had been told they imagined conversations that happened behind closed doors. Holding the phone where he could see it, I said, "I'm recording this conversation." His expression changed instantly. "You're what?" "I've never shown any romantic interest in you. I don't want you to leave your wife, and I don't want a relationship with you. You can't record me without permission. We're in a one-party consent state." His jaw tightened. "I came here to discuss the Q3 projections. You turned this into an inappropriate personal conversation, and I'm asking you to stop." Richard buttoned his jacket and retreated behind the desk, slipping back into the role of the confident executive. "Be careful, Sierra." "Is that a threat?" "It's advice." Richard planted both hands on the desk and looked at me with complete confidence. "You're young, you're confused. You've spent 2 years making yourself indispensable to me, and now that I've finally admitted what we both know, you're panicking." "I made myself indispensable because you rarely did your own work." The answer wiped the smile off his face. "Watch your tone." "Then stop pretending we're in love." His expression hardened. "It isn't harassment when the attraction is mutual." "There isn't any attraction. I'm telling you no." "You're just playing hard to get." "No, Richard, I'm rejecting you." For the first time, the confidence he'd worn all afternoon began to crack. I placed my tablet on his desk. You won't be my supervisor much longer. Tomorrow morning, this recording goes to HR. You're making a serious mistake. No, you already made it. He laughed bitterly. I'm offering you a future most women would kill for. I turned toward the door. You really think Eleanor is going to choose you? He called after me. She knows exactly how valuable I am. You're just the junior coordinator who orders lunch. I stopped with my hand on the doorknob. Then you shouldn't have confessed your imaginary affair to the junior coordinator who recorded the entire conversation. I walked out before he could recover. He shouted my name more than once across the empty office. I never turned around. That night, I listened to the recording over and over, searching for anything I might have said or done that could honestly be misunderstood. Listening to the recording again only confirmed what I already knew. I had rejected him repeatedly. Richard hadn't misunderstood me. He'd simply decided my answer didn't matter. After barely sleeping, I went straight to Human Resources the next morning. Janice Harper listened to the recording in silence. By the time Richard described us as a future power couple, she had taken off her glasses and was rubbing the bridge of her nose. Oh, Sierra! I want to file a formal harassment complaint. Richard's under a great deal of pressure, she said carefully. I'm not excusing him, but he may have mistaken your professionalism for something else. I wasn't being friendly, I was doing my job. She hesitated. Because he's the vice president and Eleanor's husband, we need to handle this carefully. So I report harassment, and your solution is to move me 3 hours away instead of investigating the executive who caused it. When she asked me to lower my voice, I refused. I want this complaint documented, a formal investigation opened, and written confirmation that I won't be transferred or disciplined for reporting executive misconduct. I'll have to take this to senior leadership, then take it. Back at my desk, I packed the few personal belongings I kept there. I didn't expect Janice to protect me, and I certainly didn't believe Richard would admit what he'd done. More than anything, I couldn't imagine Eleanor Vance choosing a 25-year-old coordinator over her own husband. 20 minutes later, my desk phone rang. Sierra Miller? Yes. This is Eleanor Vance. Come to my office, now. The call ended before I could answer. I stared at the half-packed box on my desk. Richard had been certain Eleanor would stand behind him. As the executive elevator climbed to the 42nd floor, I was convinced I was about to lose my job. Instead, I was walking into the meeting that would end his. Eleanor's office occupied the corner of the building, overlooking Manhattan through floor-to-ceiling windows. The room was elegant without trying to impress anyone, the kind of space that reflected quiet authority rather than wealth. Her assistant led me into a conference room, offered me a bottle of the sparkling water, and quietly left. A moment later, Eleanor walked in carrying a slim folder. Janice tells me you've filed a sexual harassment complaint against my husband. I'm reporting him, I corrected. And I have a recording. She held out her hand. Let's hear it. Richard's voice filled the room as he talked about our imaginary relationship, insisted I'd been hiding my feelings for 2 years, and announced he was leaving Eleanor for me. Then my own voice answered calmly and repeatedly rejecting him. When the recording ended, Eleanor remained silent for several seconds before asking, he honestly believes you order his lunch because you're in love with him. I order it because it's the only meal he won't send back. And the dressing? If it touches the lettuce, he complains. The extra bacon? He says meetings make him hungry. For the first time, the corner of her mouth lifted. He's an idiot. I wisely chose not to comment. She opened Janice's report. You filed this complaint today, and her solution was to transfer you to the warehouse in New Jersey, even though you live in Manhattan. Yes. She closed the folder with a quiet snap. You're not going to New Jersey. Relief finally loosened the knot in my chest. So, am I being fired? No. Then what happens to Richard? Eleanor leaned back, studying me for a long moment before answering. That depends on how much he's been hiding from me. My husband has threatened to leave me before, usually after I refuse one of his vanity projects or question an expense he thinks deserves my blind approval. She glanced toward the skyline. Richard loves the idea of independence. He's just never had to live it. I stayed quiet. The house is mine, Eleanor said evenly. The cars are mine, his shares are restricted, and he only became an executive because I approved it. Richard enjoys my success. He didn't build it. Everything suddenly made sense. If he really planned to leave her, he'd need someone else to finance the life he imagined. He told me he was offering me the world. A faint, humorless smile crossed her face. He doesn't own the world he promised you. She reached for a legal pad. You manage his calendar, travel, expense reports, restaurant reservations, client gifts, everything? I also prepare his expense reports from the receipts he submits. How far back can you access? 3 years without requesting archived records. Good. I want you to review all of it. I looked up. You want me to review all of it? Every flight, hotel, dinner, consulting invoice, gift, and reimbursement. Compare every expense with his calendar, Flag anything that doesn't add up and preserve every document exactly as you find it. The instructions were too precise to be spontaneous. You think he's stealing? I think a man arrogant enough to proposition his assistant inside his wife's company has probably made other reckless decisions. Entitlement usually leaves a paper trail. That isn't proof. No, she said. That's why I'm asking you to find it. I looked down at my phone. This puts me in the middle of your marriage. You were dragged into my marriage the moment Richard imagined one with you. The bluntness of the answer caught me off guard. Seeing my reaction, her voice softened. I'm not asking you to investigate an affair. I'm asking you to determine whether a senior executive abused company funds. And if I don't find anything, you'll report to a different supervisor and continue your career. And if I do, you'll be rewarded appropriately. I'd rather know what that means. A small smile crossed her face. I was hoping you'd ask. She wrote a note on the legal pad, tore it off, and slid it toward me. You're far more valuable to this company than Richard ever realized. As I stood to leave, one question lingered. Does he know you've heard the recording? Not yet. Janice knows enough to stay nervous. What should I do if he approaches me? Keep every interaction professional, never be alone with him, and record anything inappropriate if the law allows. I nodded and headed for the door. Sierra, I turned back. You did exactly the right thing. I hadn't heard anyone in management say that to me in weeks. Back at my desk, Richard still hadn't returned. His calendar claimed he was attending a client strategy meeting, but judging by the golf glove he usually carried afterward, I doubted the meeting involved much strategy. I opened the expense database and started reviewing the previous quarter. At first, everything looked routine until the same vague client relations event. Expense kept appearing for nearly $4,000 at a time. Every claim used the same generic descriptions: potential lead, executive dinner, consulting discussion. Yet none listed a client. Comparing Richard's calendar with his expense reports quickly exposed the pattern. Expensive client dinners appeared almost every week, yet there were rarely any identifiable clients attached to them. By lunchtime, I'd already flagged 12 questionable transactions. At exactly 12:17, Richard walked in wearing a golf glove and carrying a Starbucks cup, as though the previous day's confession had never happened. Morning, Sierra. It's afternoon. He smiled, set the drink on my desk and nudged it toward me. Caramel macchiato, your favorite. I glanced at the cup without touching it. I'd been drinking plain black coffee every morning for 2 years, yet Richard still handed me a caramel macchiato, another reminder that he'd fallen for a version of me that had never existed. Thank you, I said. He leaned closer. We should talk later, about the transition. What transition? His smile returned. You know? No, Richard, I really don't. His expression tightened, but footsteps echoed down the hallway, and he quietly backed away. Later, he said before disappearing into his office. As soon as Richard's office door closed, I returned to the expense reports. One receipt immediately caught my attention. Richard had claimed an expensive French restaurant as a client dinner, but something about it felt off. I called the restaurant, identified myself as someone in corporate accounting conducting an audit, and less than 10 minutes later they emailed the original receipt. The receipt wasn't for a client meeting at all. It covered an expensive dinner for two, complete with a bottle of wine, and the restaurant confirmed Richard had been the only company representative there. Nearly every Friday, he'd submitted a florist invoice for almost $300, always delivered to the same address on the Upper East Side. The address matched neither Eleanor's home nor any company property, leaving only one obvious conclusion. Richard had been sending flowers somewhere else every Friday. A quick property search confirmed the apartment was leased to Monica Vale. I carried the file upstairs just before 5. Eleanor read every page in silence, stopping only when she reached the florist invoices. Who is Monica Vale? She gave a short, bitter laugh. Richard's yoga instructor. I couldn't help shaking my head. So I was never the reason. No, she said, closing the file. Either Monica was gone or he could no longer afford her. You were simply the next woman he convinced himself would admire him. Without another word, she picked up the phone. Legal has enough. Suspend Richard Sterling's building access, disable every company account, and secure his office before he has the chance to destroy anything. After ending the call, she looked directly at me. Go back to your desk. What happens now? A cold smile touched her face. Richard is about to find out how little of his life actually belongs to him. I had barely returned to my desk before the entire building changed. The office carried on as if it were any other afternoon. Phones rang, printers hummed, and Richard's office door stayed closed long enough for me to wonder whether Eleanor had decided to wait. When the door finally opened, Richard stepped out looking as relaxed as ever, a golf glove tucked into one pocket, his blazer hanging over one shoulder while he casually spun his car keys. So, he said, stopping beside my desk, have you thought about what I said yesterday? I kept my attention on the spreadsheet in front of me. I'm working. You don't have to pretend anymore. I looked up from my screen. Richard, I honestly don't know what conversation you think we're having, but it isn't happening. The transition, he said quietly. You and me. I finally looked up. There is no you and me. Before he could answer, every monitor inside his office went dark. His smile vanished as he rushed back into the office, cycling through his keyboard, phone, and security badge before realizing none of them worked anymore. At that moment, the executive elevator opened, and 2 corporate security officers walked onto the floor. Conversations stopped across the office as people realized security wasn't there for a routine visit. Mr. Sterling, the taller officer said, we need your building badge, company phone, and laptop. Richard gave a confused laugh. My systems are down. You should probably call IT. Neither officer moved. Your employment has been terminated effective immediately for gross misconduct and financial irregularities uncovered during an internal investigation. Richard stared at the 2 security officers, convinced they'd made some absurd mistake. I'm the vice president. Not anymore, Mr. Sterling. Your employment has been terminated effective immediately. His confidence vanished almost instantly, replaced by a look I'd never seen on him before. Genuine panic. You don't know who you're talking to. We know exactly who you used to be. The office went silent. Nobody touched a keyboard or said a word while Richard searched the room for someone willing to defend him. Richard looked around the room, searching for a familiar face until his eyes landed on me. Sierra, he said, almost pleading now. Tell them what's really happening. I pushed back my chair and faced him. What exactly do you want me to tell them? That we're together. They're trying to keep us apart. I know you're leaving, Eleanor, I said calmly. What I don't understand is why you think it has anything to do with me. He searched my face for any sign I was joking. You can't mean that. I've told you repeatedly that I'm not interested. You remembered my schedule, ordered my lunches, smiled whenever we talked. Don't tell me none of that meant anything. It meant I was doing my job, Richard. I treated you the same way I treated clients, co-workers, and everyone else who depended on me professionally. He opened his mouth, but whatever answer he'd expected never came. Frustration quickly replaced disbelief. You led me on. No, Richard. You invented a relationship that never existed. His voice cracked. I spent thousands on you. I gave up everything. You never bought me a single gift. The only thing you destroyed was your own marriage. It was supposed to be for us. There was never an us. Before Richard could say another word, the 2 security officers stepped in and took hold of his arms. He pulled against them, still staring at me as if reality had suddenly betrayed him. You can't do this. I'm not doing anything, I replied. I'm simply refusing to lie for you. You promised. I never promised you anything. His voice rose as he struggled to pull free. They're lying! No one answered. The entire office watched in silence. Even Janice stood motionless near the hallway, her expression somewhere between shock and regret. Richard looked at me one last time. Sierra, tell them you love me. I held his gaze. I've never loved you. The words seemed to drain the last bit of certainty from his face. You used me. You manipulated me. No, Richard. I rejected you, reported you, and refused to protect your lies. Those are very different things. You wanted everything I could give you. All I ever wanted was for you to sign your reports on time. Someone near reception let out a laugh, and the tension holding the room together finally broke. A few more people couldn't hold it in, while Richard stood frozen, realizing the entire office had just witnessed his fantasy collapse. His face twisted with humiliation as the guards escorted him toward the elevators. One polished Italian loafer slipped off and skidded across the marble floor, coming to rest beside reception. No one bothered to pick it up. You'll regret this, he shouted. Eleanor will come crawling back. You'll all regret it. No one answered. The elevator doors closed on Richard's final threat, leaving the office silent for only a few seconds before whispers spread across the floor. Did that really just happen? He actually thought she was in love with him. I thought they were arguing about budgets. Janice hurried over. Sierra, I'm fine. You don't look fine. I'll survive. She hesitated before lowering her voice. I should have handled yesterday differently. I met her eyes. Yes. She looked down. I'm sorry. Her apology couldn't undo what had happened, but at least she had finally admitted she'd been wrong. The rest of the afternoon passed in uneasy silence. IT erased Richard's access from every system while facilities cleared out his office. By the time I packed my bag, his name had already disappeared from the company directory, as if he'd never worked there. Even after Richard's name disappeared from every company system, I couldn't shake one sentence he'd repeated during the confrontation. I bought you things. He hadn't mentioned flowers or lunches. He'd said, things. If Richard had really believed he'd spent money on me, then someone had deliberately created paperwork to support that fantasy. What if he'd bought them for someone else and simply recorded my name on the paperwork? I reopened the expense reports and searched for Whit Miller. But nothing appeared. When I shortened the search to past, dozens of entries filled the screen, and one immediately caught my attention. 3 months earlier, Richard had submitted an £500 diamond tennis bracelet as a closing bonus for S. Miller. I stared at the invoice long enough to feel my stomach tighten. I had never received either a bonus or a bracelet from Richard, which meant someone had deliberately created paperwork suggesting I had. He hadn't only imagined a relationship, he'd created financial records to make it appear real. If anyone audited those files without context, it would appear I'd accepted expensive gifts from my married boss. I immediately downloaded every receipt connected to the transaction before carrying the folder upstairs to Eleanor. She studied the invoice in silence, then looked up. Did Richard ever give you this bracelet? No. Any jewelry at all? Never. She closed the folder. Then he didn't just harass you. Her eyes met mine. He deliberately created documents that implicated you. For the first time since everything began, I thought the nightmare might finally be over. Instead, it was only changing shape. 3 days after Richard was escorted out of the building, my phone exploded with LinkedIn notifications before I even reached the office. He had published an article titled, "The Dangers of Office Politics, How One Young Employee Destroyed a Company." Hum never mentioned my full name, but he included my position, department, age, and the fact that I'd worked under him for 2 years. Anyone in our industry could identify me within minutes. According to Richard, I'd pursued him, accepted expensive gifts, and fabricated harassment allegations after he refused to promote me. By the time I arrived at work, the article had already spread through the industry. Whether people believed him completely or simply weren't sure what to think hardly mattered. Doubt alone was enough to damage a reputation. Richard didn't need everyone to believe him. Creating enough uncertainty to damage my reputation was already a victory in his mind. At 9:12 that morning, he went even further. Before losing access to the company systems, he'd copied the employee directory and emailed every department under the subject line, "The Truth About Sierra Miller." The message accused me of seducing him, accepting an $8,500 bracelet, hiding our relationship, and blackmailing him when he refused to leave Eleanor. At the bottom was a single attachment, the bracelet receipt. Without everything else we'd uncovered, it looked less like evidence against Richard and more like proof that his story was true. I could feel people reading Richard's email before anyone said a word. The atmosphere around my desk shifted. Conversations stopped when I walked by. Co-workers avoided my eyes, and the few who looked at me glanced instinctively at my wrist, as if expecting to see an expensive bracelet instead of my Apple Watch. Within an hour, people who had worked beside me for 2 years were quietly questioning everything they thought they knew. Around 10, I overheard 2 people from accounting talking behind a partition. "Do you think she really got the bracelet?" "I don't know. The receipt has her name on it. I always thought she got promoted pretty fast." I stood there for a moment, listening. A single forged receipt had suddenly outweighed 2 years of work in the eyes of people who barely knew the full story. Instead of arguing, I went straight upstairs. Eleanor was already reading Richard's email. "You've seen it. I received it 6 minutes before you did. He sent it to everyone." "I know. My career is over." She looked up from the email. "Your career isn't over. People believe documents. They believe incomplete documents. My name is on the receipt. So is Richard's approval signature. They won't care." "I do." The certainty in her voice steadied me. She walked to the window before turning back. When people realize they're losing everything, they usually make one final mistake. "He destroyed my reputation." "No," she said calmly. "He committed defamation." I dropped into the nearest chair. "It doesn't feel like I'm winning." "It isn't a victory. It's simply the next fight. I spent years building my reputation. How do I fix this?" She unlocked a tablet. "I hired someone yesterday. A forensic accountant, a private investigator." She turned the screen toward me. The investigator had documented every meeting between Richard and Monica, including the moment he handed her the same diamond bracelet that supposedly belonged to me. Richard hadn't bought the bracelet for me. He'd bought it for Monica, and Eleanor could prove it. Every photograph matched the expense report. Monica wore the bracelet at the cafe, walking her dog, at yoga, and later that evening at dinner. After 48 hours of surveillance, there was no room for doubt. "Our investigator documented everything," Eleanor said, enlarging one of the photos. "Richard used your name to hide the purchase, so everyone who received his email will soon receive another." She pressed the intercom. "Rebecca, have legal come up immediately." 2 attorneys arrived within minutes, laptops already open. Eleanor pointed to Richard's email. "Add defamation to the complaint. We have authenticated photographs, metadata, timestamps, surveillance records, and I want every post preserved before he has a chance to delete it." One attorney nodded. "We'll also prepare a cease and desist." "Good." After they left, Eleanor poured herself a cup of black coffee. Without looking up, she asked, "How long have you been drinking it this way?" "Since college. Richard insisted you loved caramel macchiatos. I've never ordered one." She gave a faint shake of her head. "My husband spent 2 years obsessing over a woman who existed only in his imagination. I knew she wasn't talking only about me. She was talking about the man she'd been married to for 20 years. After a long silence, she said quietly, "He never really saw people. He only saw what they could do for him." Neither of us had anything to add. That evening, I reached my apartment just after 8. As I turned the corner, I stopped. Richard was sitting on the front steps. The tailored suits were gone, replaced by wrinkled clothes. Dark circles framed his eyes, grey roots showed beneath fading hair dye, and a battered cardboard box rested at his feet. He stood as soon as he saw me. "Sierra." I stayed behind the security door. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk." "No, I've been waiting for 3 hours." "I didn't ask you to." His shoulders sagged. They froze everything. My accounts, my credit cards. I have nowhere to go. For a split second, I almost felt sorry for him. Then I remembered the lies, the forged receipt, and the email he'd sent to destroy my reputation. "Leave." "I brought your things." "My things?" I asked. He lifted the box. "Everything I ever bought for you." "You never bought me anything." His voice turned desperate. "If you just admit we were together, Eleanor might stop." "We were never together. You can fix this." "I didn't break it. I've lost everything." "You lost what was never yours." He stepped closer to the glass. "I was vice president. You worked for Eleanor. I had a Porsche. You still couldn't drive a manual." Embarrassment flickered across his face before anger swallowed it. "You ruined my life." "No, you ruined it yourself. You destroyed my marriage." "You did. You turned Eleanor against me. You introduced yourself as my boyfriend. I loved you. You loved the fantasy you'd invented." He slammed his fist against the glass hard enough to shake the entrance. "You'll regret this." I didn't flinch. I recorded every conversation. His expression changed. "Eleanor also has photographs of Monica wearing the bracelet." The color drained from his face. I know everything." He stared at me, then at the box in his hands. Without another word, he dropped it onto the sidewalk and backed away. Police sirens echoed from the next block, confirming someone inside the building had already called them. Richard turned and disappeared before they arrived. I waited until he was gone, unlocked the entrance, and used the tip of my umbrella to push the box open. Inside the box were nothing but stolen office supplies, staplers, printer cartridges, pens, and a label maker he'd apparently intended to leave in my apartment. Even now, he had planned one last attempt to frame me. I closed the box and finally understood what made Richard dangerous. It wasn't his position. It was the fact that he had nothing left to lose. 12 days later, his attorneys released a public apology to every employee, every client, and everyone who had shared his LinkedIn post. Richard admitted the accusations against me were false. He acknowledged I'd never accepted jewelry, never encouraged a personal relationship, and had reported his conduct through the proper channels. The apology fixed the official record, but it couldn't erase the memory of coworkers staring at my wrist. When I returned to work the following Monday, the whispers were gone. People apologized awkwardly, admitting they shouldn't have believed the email. I accepted every apology. Trust, however, is harder to restore than a reputation. Around noon, Janice knocked on my office door. Since Richard's dismissal, she'd started knocking before entering. "I owe you a real apology," she said. "I failed you. I protected the executive instead of the employee reporting misconduct." She offered no excuses, only the changes she'd already proposed. Mandatory reporting procedures, outside investigators for complaints involving senior executives, legal approval before transferring anyone who reported harassment, and an anonymous reporting system. "You frightened me into becoming a better HR director." "I wasn't trying to." "I know," she said. "I'm still grateful." After she left, I realized Richard hadn't just exposed himself. He'd exposed a company that had spent too many years protecting authority instead of accountability. Over the following weeks, every audit uncovered more problems. None matched Richard's fraud, but together they revealed years of careless oversight. Before long, legal, finance, and compliance were all sending me files whenever numbers stopped making sense. One afternoon, Eleanor asked me upstairs. Instead of lawyers, I found her standing beside the windows overlooking the Hudson. "Do you know why I built this office with glass walls?" I shook my head. "So everyone remembers they're visible." Richard always wanted thicker walls. He preferred privacy. "And you?" "I prefer accountability." She invited me to sit. The divorce is final. Between the settlement and the repayment agreement, Richard walked away with almost nothing. "And Monica?" "She disappeared the moment the corporate credit card did." For the first time since the investigation began, We both laughed without forcing it. Then Eleanor slid a thick folder across the desk. Inside were the reports, timelines, interview notes, receipts, and evidence logs I'd compiled throughout the investigation. You notice patterns, she said, not just in numbers, but in people. You preserve evidence, ask the right questions, and see what everyone else misses. She closed the folder and looked at me. I'm creating a new department, internal compliance. For 20 years, this company chased growth, she continued. We rarely stopped to ask whether anyone was being held accountable. That changes today, and I need someone who won't be intimidated by a title. I was intimidated, but you reported him anyway. I was terrified. A faint smile crossed her face. So was I. I always suspected Richard wasn't as honest as he pretended to be. I simply underestimated how far he was willing to go. She slid a contract across the desk. It was an offer to become Director of Internal Compliance, reporting directly to her and the board's audit committee, with a 30% raise and full authority to investigate any executive. I read every page before looking up. There are people here with far more experience than I have. There are, she replied. None of them brought me the evidence you did. I nodded slowly. Then I have one condition. My department answers only to the CEO and the board. If I'm expected to investigate executives, I can't report through operations or human resources. Her smile widened. That's exactly the answer I hoped for. I signed. 3 weeks later, I moved into my new office. It wasn't extravagant, but it had a window, a door that closed, and enough quiet to think. For the first time since joining the company, my job wasn't built around protecting someone else's schedule. A small package was waiting on my desk that first morning. The bracelet inside made my stomach tighten until I noticed the receipt. Amazon, 42 cubic zirconia. Tucked beneath it was a handwritten note. Never let someone else decide what your story means. Show EV. I laughed quietly. Richard had tried to use a bracelet to rewrite my life. Eleanor had turned one into a reminder that he never would. I wore it to work the next day without explaining where it came from. No one asked where it had come from, and I was perfectly happy to leave it that way. By the second month, compliance audits had become routine across every department. Missing receipts suddenly reappeared, executive meetings were documented properly, and expense reports arrived on time with a level of accuracy I'd never seen before. Accountability spread through the company faster than fear ever had. People who had ignored accounting rules for years suddenly followed every policy without being reminded. One afternoon, I overheard 2 department managers whispering outside the elevators. They fell silent when they noticed me. We were just talking. I assumed so. You're not auditing marketing next, are you? I smiled. If you followed company policy, you have nothing to worry about. The answer seemed to worry him anyway. For years, junior employees had been expected to fear executives. Now executives had started respecting the possibility that someone was finally paying attention. One Friday evening, Eleanor stopped by my office. How's the first month? Busy. Any regrets? I looked around my office before answering. If I'd accepted Janice's transfer to New Jersey, Richard would probably still be in the executive suite, dealing from the company and looking for someone else to blame. None. She nodded once and walked away. My eyes drifted to the inexpensive bracelet resting beside my keyboard. It cost less than $50, but nobody could use it against me, and that made it worth far more than any diamond. Within 2 months, Richard's name had disappeared from every directory, organizational chart, and parking assignment. The company hadn't forgotten him. It had simply learned a different version of his story. The whispered conversations disappeared, replaced by people double-checking expense reports before they reached my desk. My office was small, but it belonged to me. The shelves held audit files instead of lunch menus, and every so often I'd instinctively reach for Richard's calendar before remembering I never worked for him anymore. The bracelet Eleanor gave me stayed in my desk drawer until important meetings. I wore it not because it was beautiful, but because it reminded me that someone else would never define my story again. Our first major audit uncovered nothing dramatic, only years of careless bookkeeping. Even so, the marketing director looked nervous before I asked a single question. I've already corrected everything. I haven't asked anything yet. I know, he admitted. I figured you would. I almost laughed. Richard had tried to build my reputation with lies. Instead, he'd accidentally built one based on accountability. A few weeks later, Eleanor invited me to lunch. For the first time, we left the files behind. How are you sleeping? She asked. Better. You still record difficult conversations. Sometimes. Good. Evidence has a way of outliving opinions. After a pause, she added, so do people who know how to protect themselves. I'd wanted to ask her something for weeks. Why didn't you assume I was lying? She stirred her coffee before answering. My father built this company. Before he died, he told me that if someone to risk their career to tell you an uncomfortable truth, you listen before defending the powerful. I thought about how close I'd come to resigning. I was sure everyone would choose Richard. They almost did. But you didn't. I'd spent 20 years married to him, she said quietly. I knew exactly how convincing he could be. She never said another word about their marriage. She didn't need to. Life moved on. The investigation closed, new compliance policies took effect, and the company slowly changed with them. I still noticed every request to close an office door or keep this between us, but fear no longer controlled my decisions. Months later, while driving through New Jersey, I spotted Richard working at a used car dealership. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by a dealership polo, as he tried to sell an aging Honda Civic to a young couple. His confident smile was still there, but now customers interrupted him. Another salesperson finished answering his questions, and a manager called him back inside before the sale was done. Watching Richard quietly follow another manager's instructions made something obvious. The confidence he'd carried for years had never really belonged to him. Without Eleanor's company, money, and title behind him, he was simply another employee trying to keep his job. Richard never noticed my car as I drove past, and I didn't slow down. By then, revenge no longer mattered. Walking away without looking back was enough. The following Monday, I took my usual seat at the head of the weekly compliance meeting while department heads settled around the conference table. Just before I opened the first audit file, one executive smiled and asked, "Before we start, would you mind ordering lunch for everyone?" The room fell silent. Several people stared at him in disbelief. He clearly had no idea who I used to be. I glanced at the bracelet on my wrist before meeting his eyes. "The catering portal is on the company intranet," I said with an easy smile. "You can submit the request yourself." A few quiet laughs broke the tension. His face flushed red. "Right, of course." I nodded, opened the audit binder, and looked around the table. "Now, let's talk about the numbers." No one interrupted for the rest of the meeting. As the afternoon sun caught the inexpensive bracelet around my wrist, I couldn't help thinking how strange life had become. It wasn't made of diamonds and cost less than $50, yet it meant more than the one Richard had tried to use against me. That bracelet had been built on lies. This one represented the life I had fought to keep. No one restored my reputation out of kindness. I earned it back by refusing to surrender the truth day after day, until the facts spoke louder than the rumors ever had. In the end, nobody handed my reputation back to me. I rebuilt it one report, one investigation, and one difficult conversation at a time until the rumors finally disappeared on their own. Across the river, Richard was spending another ordinary Monday trying to sell another used car. I drove away before he ever noticed my car. By then, proving I'd won no longer mattered. Living a life that no longer included Richard was more than enough.